So, hello everyone. We're so glad to have you here for today's program. My name is Shay Corey, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by the Director of Research and Analytics at PlaceEconomics, Alyssa Frystak, and by my coworker, Zachary Burt, who is running the live stream on Facebook. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have just a few things to go over before we get started. First, I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Antunovich Associates, Fire Blender Bell, EHC Traceries Inc., and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. Moving on, just a few notes on how the webinar will run today. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box that is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll go through those towards the end of the program. The chat will not be available during the presentation, but it will be open for the discussion and question period. If you're joining us on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring any questions you have that you can submit in the comments section, and he'll send those to me over here on Zoom. So now that we've covered all of the housekeeping items, I'm so pleased to introduce you to today's speaker, Alyssa Frystak. She's, as I mentioned before, the Director of Research and Data Analytics at PlaceEconomics, a Washington, D.C.-based research firm specializing in the analysis of the economic impacts of historic preservation. There, she is responsible for data acquisition and preparation, methodology development, and analysis. Alyssa is well-versed in GIS, census data, municipal data, as well as various other data resources. She's a graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she was the inaugural recipient of the Menkoff Family Fellowship in Historic Preservation. Her master's thesis, Small But Mighty, Combating the Affordable Housing Crisis Through Small-Scale Historic Rehabilitation, examined the tools, incentives, and policies that help preserve and create subsidized and unsubsidized affordable housing in designated and non-designated buildings. She currently serves as the chair of the Skyline Council of Landmarks, Illinois, and she is joining us from Chicago. So thank you so much, Alyssa, for being here, and we're really excited for your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Shay. I'm just going to share my screen. Righty. Okay. All right. That was an excellent introduction. Actually, most of the things that I was going to cover on my intro slide, Shay, you covered for me. But yes, I am coming to you from Chicago. I'm so glad to be here. As you can see from my little bio there, affordable housing is something that I have been very interested in undergrad and then grad school and everything like that. So just so happy to be here today to talk with you about that. So you all are here to talk about this intersection of historic preservation and affordable housing. So here's a little rundown of the topics we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk a bit about what the affordable housing crisis is nationally. Then a little bit about older and historic housing and how that housing supply is indeed playing a role in meeting affordable housing needs. Then we'll talk about preservationist attitudes towards affordable housing and some of its strategies. And then finally, I'll put forth some ideas for action. So in essence, this is the reality of what is happening today. We are systematically tearing down housing that is affordable and replacing it with what is not. So first, let's start out by naming some of the basic realities. The first being, there really is an affordable housing crisis. This is not something that has been devised or politicized. It's truly a reality of what is happening in this country today. Second, the crisis is happening almost everywhere. This is not a big city problem or a rural problem. We're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing it in Rust Belt cities, legacy cities. It's truly kind of embedded in our housing market today. Third, relying on the creation of affordable housing through programs that currently exist will not solve this problem alone. Next, this is one of the mantras that we have developed at PlaceEconomics through our data-driven research, and that is that you can't build new and rent or sell cheap. And I'll talk a little bit about this later. Fifth, it's not just rent or mortgage payments. This issue of affordability is affected by proximity to work, transit, shopping, schools, etc. And then finally, every time a unit of older housing is lost, a unit of potentially affordable housing is lost. This is another mantra that I will give an example of a little bit later. So I want to kick us off here by going through some definitions that we should be keeping in mind when we talk about affordable housing and preservation. So one distinction that I want to make right off the bat is the difference between affordable housing with an uppercase A and affordable housing with a lowercase a. When we're talking about small scale, single family or multifamily buildings, we're mainly talking about unsubsidized affordable housing. This is affordable housing with a lowercase a. This type of housing doesn't generally rely on subsidies, but rather the owner's ability to rehab and maintain their building in an economical manner. This in turn allows the owner to make their units available at relatively affordable prices. The one overarching caveat to this type of affordable housing is that the supply of it is also dependent on a bunch of different variables, including public policies, development pressure, building codes, parking requirements, development fees, property values, the list goes on. These variables have everything to do with whether or not the private market provides housing that is affordable. Then there is affordable housing with an uppercase A. This is mainly provided when the public sector subsidizes it and is usually achieved through some combination of low-income housing tax credits on the front end and then housing choice vouchers for tenants on the back end. When used with preservation, this affordable housing relies on sophisticated layering of finances, which commonly includes historic tax credits. Therefore, when people usually think about the intersection of historic preservation for affordable housing, they're most likely thinking about this kind of subsidized affordable housing. Similarly, preservation is often looked at through this uppercase versus lowercase analogy, due in large part to our field's definition of what is quote unquote historic. So it can be argued that formal historic designation is easier to achieve in large scale buildings, which tend to have a documentable history and often possess high style characteristics. Designation stipulations are part of a long established norm for the use of preservation incentives. So these incentives often serve as gap funding in affordable housing developments. Therefore, uppercase preservation is often used to provide uppercase affordable housing. However, small scale vernacular buildings make up the majority of a city's housing stock. These buildings often lack the historic and architectural significance and sometimes integrity needed to qualify for historic designation. So a lot of times when we're talking about older, small scale residential buildings, these are often the buildings that fall into the lowercase preservation category. While they make up a large share of our city's fabric, they aren't what the field of preservation would consider worthy of formal designation. And this means that in every city, a large share of older buildings are not eligible to receive traditional preservation incentives, thus making it more difficult to provide lowercase affordable housing. So there really is a mismatch here. This funding gap produced by historic designation stipulations proves problematic as it makes it difficult for property owners to not only rehabilitate, but also create and maintain unsubsidized affordable housing in small scale vernacular residential buildings. So just to lay a little bit more groundwork for some definitions as we begin to discuss the reality of this crisis. You're going to hear me say housing cost burdened quite a bit in this presentation. And what that means is that a household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. You'll also hear me mention severely housing cost burdened. And that means that a household is spending more than 50% of their income on housing costs. So nationally, half of all renters are cost burdened, including 26% that are severely cost burdened. That means that a fourth of the renter households in America are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. That translates to almost 12 million renter households that are severely housing cost burdened. Another thing to keep in mind is that 75% of very low income households receive no housing assistance. So when people say, oh, well, we've got plenty of programs to help low income people with housing costs, there is still a very large share of the population that is falling through the cracks. And then finally, nearly a quarter of all 65 and over households are renters, which is an increase from its rate of 14% 20 years ago. Also, 73% of all 20 to 34-year-old households are renters, also up from its rate in 2001. So there really has been this shift of both older and younger households renting, likely out of necessity. We hear this all the time, especially from people of my generation, is that, we can't really afford to buy, we have to rent. Here's where there is a concentration of rent-burdened households. So the darker the color, the larger the share of housing cost-burdened households in that area. As you can see along the coasts and in major city centers, there are very few places where there is a low concentration of cost-burdened renters. However, when we look at this issue of housing cost burden, we find that it is not just a renter problem. Almost a quarter of homeowners in housing are housing cost burdened, including 10% that are severely housing cost burdened. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit into the DC area. Here we find that 44% of renter households are cost burdened and 22% of homeowner households are cost burdened. As you can see, there are very few census tracts where less than 30% of the households are cost burdened, especially in the renter category. So there's a pattern that has allowed for this to happen. As you can see, this graph tracks the change in median household income, median rent, and median home values over the past 20 years or so at the national level. If incomes are going up, but the rent and housing values are going up even more, the affordability of housing is never going to catch up. And here's what that looks like in DC. Here again, we see that DC is suffering from the same pattern that is being experienced all over the country. Median household income is not keeping pace with the median rent and median home values. In fact, here in DC since 2000, incomes have gone up about 155%, but home values have gone up almost 360%, while rents have increased by almost 195%. So it's this spread between what people are earning compared to what they have to spend on housing that is really the crux of this crisis. And this will continue to remain a challenge over the next decade. Over 6 million jobs are going to be created in the next 10 years, but a third of them are jobs in 3 categories. And those are nurses aide or kind of caregiver type jobs, cooks, and waiters or waitresses. So the median pay for those types of jobs is relatively low at only $23,000 per year, meaning that they can only afford about $600 a month in rent. And so I'd like to just take a minute here and have you think about where can you find any units that rent for less than $600 a month. I can guarantee you might be struggling to come up with a location for where you could find a unit like that. So now what you've all been waiting for, we're going to talk a little bit about some really basic economic concepts. So first, the law of demand states that whenever the price of a product increases, the demand will fall. And then when the price decreases, the demand will increase in the market. But then the law of supply says that when the price of a product increases, the quantity of the product suppliers offers will increase. When the price of the product decreases, the quantity of the product will also decrease. But when it comes to housing, we have broken the laws of both supply and demand, which means that as it pertains to housing, there has been a market failure. This means that the demand doesn't equal the supply. The market by itself is not responding to the needs of the market. So what does that mean? In a market failure, the decisions of the individual and the decisions of what's good for everybody go in different directions. And that's what we're clearly seeing happening here. And when there is a market failure, then there needs to be intervention if this kind of public interest is going to be solved. This means that the public sector and or the nonprofit sector have to step in because the private sector by itself is not going to solve the problem. So moving on to older and historic housing and affordability, there are a bunch of myths that exist when it comes to not just older housing stock, but historic housing stock in general. But here are just a few. The first being that this housing stock is just too small to meet current needs. The second is that the condition is not great and it's falling down, so it's really not worth fixing. And then finally, it really isn't what buyers are looking for today. So these are kind of the main critiques of older housing stock in general. But let's break this down a little bit and set some more framework. When you look at it, there are about 53 million housing units that are over 50 years old. So this is the body of housing that we are talking about when we say older and historic housing. And then we can break that down further to see the age of housing that renters and owners are living in. Overall, of all the housing units in America, about 32% are owners in pre-1970 housing, and about 14% are renters in pre-1970 housing. Now, the issue about, well, it's just not in good shape, it's in, really run down and bad condition, so we might as well tear it down. Just as we have a population census every 10 years, we also have a census of housing, and that's called the American Housing Survey. And the numbers presented here are from the American Housing Survey. So what this survey says is that of the pre-1970 housing units in America, over 90% are deemed to be in adequate condition. Only 5% was found to be moderately inadequate, and only 2% severely inadequate. So yes, this 7 or so odd percent is what might necessitate teardowns. But overall, the condition of housing is not the issue when we're looking at older housing. Here is the typology of pre-1970 housing units. A little over 3/4 are single family housing units. The rest of pre-1970 housing units are housed in multifamily buildings that range from 2 to 4 flats, all the way up to large 50+ unit apartment buildings. But what does the monthly housing cost look like in these older housing units? So in this graph, the yellow represents the monthly housing costs of units built before 1970, while the gray represents the monthly housing costs for units built after 1970. So if you look at the lower end, units that are in that less than $500 a month category, the share of housing units built before 1970 that fall into that category is higher than those built after 1970. And the same is true for the next category up in the $500 to $900 category. But above that, we see this ratio reversed. So this alone helps demonstrate the fact that older housing is more affordable than new. And here's who lives in pre-1970 housing by income. What you can see is that the higher the income, the less likely they are to live in older housing. Or conversely, the lower the income, the more likely they are to live in older housing. It's also true by age. The older people are, the more likely they are to live in older housing. And then when we look at poverty level households, overall, 37% of all households in the country live in pre-1970 housing. But 40% of households at 50% of the poverty line live in pre-1970 housing. and 42% of households over that 50% poverty line live in pre-1970 housing. So what other groups are more likely to live in pre-1970 housing? African Americans, people age 65 and over, the disabled, Hispanic populations, people with incomes less than 10,000, and legacy residents, or those who have lived in the same house for more than 20 years. So here we have a number of vulnerable populations. We have low-income households, we have older households, minority households, and all of these groups rely on this older housing to live. Today, there are about 4.8 million vacant housing units that were built before 1970. So we have this housing crisis, and yet we have close to 5 million housing units that are just sitting there not being used. In fact, 750,000 of those units have been vacant for more than a year. Now, the total housing shortage in the US is estimated to be at about 6.5 million units. So this means that if we were to tap into those vacant pre-1970 housing units, we could meet about 75% of the shortage. Now, some of that housing is located where the need is not the greatest, or they just don't fit the needs of the target market. These might be 3 or 4 bedroom houses where really what we need is 1 to 2 bedroom condos or apartments. But this is just to get us thinking about all the units that currently exist that we could be using to address this issue. We don't need to, and we definitely won't be able to solely build ourselves out of this crisis. We are going to need to tap into this existing housing stock. Now let's look at one program that is solely aimed at affordable housing creation, and that is the low-income housing tax credit. So since LIHTC, as it's called, was created in 1987, about 3.5 million housing units have been created. Over that same period, 11.5 million housing units that were built prior to 1970 were destroyed, either through fire or natural disaster, but the vast, vast majority of them were actually just simply torn down. So if we're only creating 3.5 million units through LIHTC and we're losing 11.5 million units, we're never going to be able to catch up with this program alone. So just to recap and do a little bit of math, again, 3.5 million affordable housing units have been created through LIHTC since 1987. In that same time, 11.5 million pre-1970 housing units were lost. That's a loss of almost 328 units per year, which is almost 900 units a day, every day for the past 35 years. Now, even though the acquisition and rehab model is a third more cost effective than new construction, about 55 to 65% of all LIHTC units are located in new construction projects. But here's why older structures need to be the first option for creating affordable housing through LIHTC. So the average cost to create a LIHTC unit in a new construction building is almost $210,000 per unit. But the average cost per LIHTC unit in a rehabilitation project is only $153,000 per unit. So also a great study that came out looked at the life cycle cost for those units, and they found that the life cycle cost for new construction were $40,000 to $70,000 higher per unit than the life cycle cost of rehab units. So when we're looking at a federal program like this, where it's of utmost importance to be fiscally responsible and make good use of taxpayer dollars, then we really should be advocating more for the use of LIHTC in existing buildings rather than new construction. Now, you might be saying, well, let's just get some protection on those older buildings with some designation or something like that so that they can't be lost and torn down that easily. According to our calculations, we show that there's only about 6% of pre-1970 housing in America is protected in the form of local or some other kind of historic designation. The other 94% can be lost at any time. But if half of the pre-1970 housing units that were demolished over the past 35 years was rehabbed instead, we would no longer have a housing shortage in the United States. Now, most of what we do at Place Economics is at the macro level. We are looking at numbers across the whole city or large census data sets. But sometimes it's useful to kind of zoom in and look at things at a much smaller scale. This was part of a micro-analysis that we published in a blog post on our website back in 2020. So in Chicago, we see a lot of small-scale multifamily residential teardowns that are either replaced with new luxury condos or single-family homes. So I found a couple of buildings in my neighborhood. These are literally 2 blocks over from me, that I wanted to use to test those two theories that I mentioned earlier. The first being you can't build new and rent or sell cheap. And the second being every unit of older housing lost is a unit of potentially affordable housing lost. So the first building was a 1909 3-flat apartment building. The second was a mid-century 5-flat apartment building. And the third was a 3-unit condo building that was built in 2018. So these buildings all sit right next to each other. And though they are on a street that with a lot of extant housing and very little infill, this street is not part of any historic district. So there is no protection on these buildings. What we found when we looked at assessment data and rental data was that on a square foot basis, apart from having an assessed value 3 times greater than that of the 1909 building, units in the new building also rent for twice as much as those in the 1909 building. So doing a little bit of more digging, we also found that the 2018 condo building replaced an early 20th century cottage style 3-flat that was undoubtedly providing naturally occurring affordable housing. So even though this is a microanalysis, its findings can be extrapolated. And when situations like this happen again and again and again all over a city, it's easy to understand how it can begin a chain reaction that plays out in property values. So we found that it's as simple as this. As so long as the market in an area is strong enough, when older housing gets torn down, that lot is rarely ever affordable again. And that has long-term implications on the affordability of the entire neighborhood. So here should be our response. We should be prioritizing the retention of modest, older, and historic housing. This can be in the form of shotguns, bungalows, row houses, flats, etc. These building typologies have historically been and continue to be the field of historic preservation's contribution to affordable housing. So who is the target market for this type of affordable housing or older housing? Sorry. First of all, 1 to 2 person households who are renters, empty nesters, and first-time home buyers. So these types of households are not a niche in the marketplace. When we look at the size of households, we find that just over 60% of all households are 1 to 2 person households. And that is a pattern that will continue to grow in the future. I bet a lot of you have heard of the tiny house movement, but the original tiny house was in fact a lot of our older or historic buildings. In San Antonio, which is a city we've done a lot of work for in the past, we found that the average size of a housing unit built before 1960 was about 650 square feet smaller than houses built after 1960. There are over 12.5 million existing pre-1970 houses that were smaller than 1,000 square feet. So we have this giant inventory of smaller houses in the form of older and historic homes that is ideal for this 1 to 2 person household and empty nesters. Older housing is also often the point of entry for first-time home buyers. 57% of all first-time home buyers bought a house that was built prior to 1950, and less than 30% of all first-time home buyers bought a home that was built after 1960, or sorry, 1999. So to say that there is just not enough of an interest in the market for this type of older housing is really just not correct. Another thing that will continue to drive the market for older housing is millennials. So in 2019, the number of millennials, which are those born between 1981 and 1996, in the United States surpassed the number of baby boomers. So that means for the next generation, that age group will have an outsized impact on how and where cities grow. So any city that's planning for a prosperous future must consider the needs and preferences of millennials. A recent study from the National Trust for Historic Preservation found that 44% of millennials surveyed wanted to live in historic, character-rich neighborhoods. And national home buying trends also back this up. These graphs are from the National Association of Realtors, which does a great job of tracking who buyers are. And despite making up only 34% of homeowners or home buyers nationally, millennials account for 59% of all buyers of houses built before 1912 and 43% of buyers of houses built between 1912 and 1960. So the American Housing Survey, also known as the Census of Housing, also asks about how satisfied people are with their housing relative to where they came from, so their previous home. And what it found was that when it comes to those who live in pre-1970 housing, a higher share of respondents said that their home was better than their previous home. Transportation is often a household's second largest monthly expenditure, and of course, right behind housing costs. So taking transportation into account when talking about affordable housing is really important. Only 38% of American Housing Survey respondents who live in post 1970 housing said that they have access to good public transportation options in their neighborhood. However, 57% of the respondents who live in pre 1970 housing or pre 1970 neighborhoods said that they have access to good public transportation. What we postulate is that it's the three C's that are driving the decision to live in older housing. The first is, of course, character. The second is cost. Often older housing is competitive in cost because of condition. It might be in need of a little bit of updating of, cabinets or carpet or things like that. Um, and then finally, convenience. Remember, most older and historic districts or neighborhoods are often located near the center of town where development first took place, and they're close to public transit and other great amenities. So there's so much misinformation and anecdotal evidence circulating out there about preservation. And a lot of this misinformation surrounds the topic of affordable housing. So lots of times we view our firm PlaceEconomics as kind of mythbusters. This is not only because we specialize in data-driven research, which includes the analysis of, data sets and things like that, but we also capture our own data in the form of surveys, and we call those Pres polls, which we put out occasionally. Some of you guys may have even answered some of these before. So one area that we were curious to learn more about was what are the attitudes that preservation professionals have when it comes to affordable housing? So one of the questions we asked was, how serious is the affordable housing crisis in the city in which you live? 0 being the affordable or housing affordability is not a problem, and 10 being housing affordability is at a crisis point in my community. Almost 92% of respondents rated the crisis in their community at a score of 5 or more. So the majority of people said that it is at least in some way playing a role in their community. Next, we asked, relative to the rest of the city, how affordable is housing in historic districts in your community? A few said that it is either very affordable or affordable, which is great. but way too many people said that it is not affordable. So we need to be thinking about what our responsibility is in fixing this. And then we asked which tools they are using in their community to help with affordable housing. Things like grants, land trusts, rent stabilization, tax freezes, increased demo fees for older housing. The most widely used type of tool was grants for repairs. There was about a third of respondents that said that, but 2/3 don't. So we have this range of tools, but very few communities actually have them. Then we asked them which tools they thought would be most effective. Remember, a third of those respondents have grants, but 3/4 said that it would be an effective tool. So other tools like policies that encourage the retention of older housing, historic preservation revolving funds, high demolition fees to discourage raising, low interest loans for repairs to historic homes, all of which were seen as effective tools, but nobody actually has them in their communities. And then finally, we asked what role, if any, should preservationists be playing in addressing the issue of affordable housing? 0 being preservationists should kind of stay in their lane and concentrate on preservation. In the middle at 5, preservationists should address affordable housing, but it really shouldn't be their top priority. And then 10 being preservationists should be leading affordable housing efforts. And the responses indicate that most preservation professionals believe that our field should be playing a major role, saying this is a problem and we can be part of the solution. Then we also did a pres poll on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. The ADUs are often cited as being one part or one tool in the toolkit of combating the affordable housing crisis. So we asked whether or not their city currently has legislation that allows for ADUs, and about 60% of respondents said yes. And then the next question we asked was, should historic districts be exempt from those provisions? About 80% of preservationists said no, historic districts should not be exempt from those opportunities to build ADUs. Then we asked to rank what the possible positive consequences of having ADUs. The number one answer was affordable housing creation, followed by efficient use of existing housing stock and increased density. So again, there's a whole list of positive benefits that preservationists identify when it comes to ADUs. We then asked respondents to rank possible negative consequences. The top answer was that ADUs could be used for short-term housing, such as Airbnbs, rather than permanent housing, followed by parking problems and increased traffic. When asked what is your personal opinion of allowing ADUs, overwhelmingly, preservationists are strongly in favor of ADU use. So this idea that preservationists are somehow trying to stop things like ADUs or other affordable housing initiatives is really just not true. So some things to consider, without calling these recommendations, because we always like to provide our recommendations after we've done, thorough stakeholder engagement and things like that. So we know that we're responding to individual community needs. But here are some ideas that you or your organization or community might think about when trying to create tools that combat the affordable housing crisis through preservation of older and historic housing. So the first thing is to recognize the importance of creating small programs for maintenance. So one of our frequent clients is the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation. They're really on the cutting edge of preservation, and they have a very forward-thinking approach to not just designated buildings, but also just older buildings in general. And they have a program that's called Under One Roof, and here's the premise. What is the biggest threat to older houses? Water, right? We always talk about water infiltration is just, a big threat. But where does water come from? course, like obviously the sky, but more specifically, it comes in through your roof if your roof is bad. So what do we need to do? Fix the roof. So they have this program where they give you $10,000 to fix your roof. Of course, this is limited to older housing, and also people of more modest financial resources. Then they have a minor repair program that provides about $25,000 per unit, as well as a weatherization grant. So not only can people use this to weatherize their homes, but hopefully they'll also be saving on utility bills when the work is done. Another thing I want to bring up regarding maintenance is that there was a great study that was done by the National Institute of Building Sciences, and they found that when you defer repairs, you may end up paying 15 times as much to make those repairs in the future. So again, this is where we really need to be thinking about what can we be doing to help people um, avoid deferring their maintenance, and keeping their buildings in good condition. The next idea to consider is that demolition should just cost more. So if losing older homes is exasperating the affordable housing crisis, which it is, and if demolition has negative environmental consequences, which it does, then when demolition happens, it should cost the building owner more to do it, unless there is a deconstruction ordinance. So this increased demolition fee would effectively discourage building owners from just demolishing buildings willy-nilly, maybe even, not allowing those lots to sit vacant for years or replacing it with less affordable options. But even here is an opportunity for something as well. We understand that not every building can be saved, and sometimes they do have to come down. But when older homes do need to come down, they should at least be deconstructed so that the materials can then be recirculated back into the local community, for, a neighbor across the street where they might be able to get a window that cost less than new materials. The next thing to consider is the creation of a mitigation fund for demolition. Now, many of you may be familiar with the federal Section 106 process. If any entity is using federal monies for a project, the project has to undergo Section 106 review to see if there are any historic resources that would be negatively impacted by the project. And if it is determined that harm would come to these resources, then the project either has to be changed to not harm the resource, or it's more likely that they will opt to come up with a mitigation measure. So a lot of times the developer or agency decides that they'd rather pay money than do something else. So we really should think about creating a similar mitigation option for demolition that allows building owners to pay into a fund that can then be used to fund, these minor repair programs or other affordable housing initiatives. So if you are tearing older stuff down, there should be a mitigation fund that they can pay into. Code enforcement policy is another important thing to consider. Too often, demolition is the go-to response for code violations, but rather there should be more discussion of alternative responses and interventions between departments. Some of these include providing rehabilitation assistance in the form of grants or incentives, or even transferring properties to nonprofit housing organizations or land banks. Those of you that work with the National Register know that there is an increasing number of what are called multiple property listings. These are similar to historic districts, but they group resources by type, and they do not require these resources to be contiguous. So for instance, here in Chicago, we have multiple property listing for single room occupancy hotels, a building type that historically provided affordable housing. We also have one for the classic Chicago bungalow, which have historically served as entry-level homes for generations of Chicagoans. These MPLs legitimize the typology and make these resources eligible for certain rehabilitation incentives, such as tax freezes and tax credits. These same tools could be used at the local level to create local MPLs that open up incentives to a whole host of vernacular housing typologies that primarily meet affordable housing needs. And then we really need to start thinking about design guidelines and standards that better fit the realities of older housing today. So, for years, preservationists have used the Secretary's standards as the kind of be all end all. But many, especially today, acknowledge that, Mount Vernon is not the same as a little three flat that's down the block from me, right? So we really should not be using the same set of standards for everything. Again, not everything is or needs to be capital P preservation. Cities should also be taking a more active role in vacant property management. When there is a vacant house in a community, they really should think about buying or acquiring it and then stabilizing it and then transferring it to, some kind of housing authority or housing nonprofit. The bottom line is when you have a unit of older housing that is sitting vacant, buy it and do something with it. Cities should be, leading by example when it comes to this vacant property effort. Or alternatively, maybe cities should have the first right of refusal on pre-1970 properties. Anytime an older property comes up for sale, the city at least has the option to acquire it. Now, most of the time, they're probably going to say no. But at least this gives the city the opportunity to think strategically about what they can do to make sure properties and neighborhoods that are potentially providing affordable housing stay that way. We should also be encouraging ADUs. So, this type of housing units have a whole host of benefits. They can provide affordable housing, they can make housing or existing dwellings more affordable for the owner. They often have a minor impact on the character of the surrounding neighborhood, and they add density at a human scale. But they also create opportunities for small developers and mom and pop type building owners. California and LA in particular is a great example of this. They have a state level legislation that allows for more than one housing unit on every lot by right. So almost every lot in the state of California, especially they've been doing this in LA, they make sure that there is more than one unit of housing there. We all know that large institutions such as hospitals, universities, churches, things like that, they often pose a risk to historic resources. Often they acquire neighboring properties and either raise them for expansion or parking. While they often cite that the overall social benefit as is an excuse to do whatever they want, they are still reducing the supply of housing. So instead of demolishing housing in these instances, these institutions should be required to relocate residential buildings. Moving buildings used to be a much more common practice. Think about it like this. Again, I'm in Chicago. If the city of Chicago was able to lift up every building in the entire city 10 feet so that we could create our sewer system in the 1850s, I think a university today with a large endowment can pay to not or to move a couple of buildings to a place where they're not in danger of being torn down. Finally, there's Airbnbs. So the original intent of Airbnbs was great. I've got a little coach house or a spare room, so why not make a little bit of money off of it? But this is not what Airbnbs have become. Today, it's not uncommon to find large management companies that operate these units, taking them out of the market for local residents and changing the affordability of the surrounding area. So if your city does have an ADU provision, there should be a few stipulations. The first being make sure there are design guidelines for this type of property in historic districts. Again, making sure that ADUs are allowable and there's a clear path to create them. And then also stipulate that they either be located in owner occupied buildings or limit the use of them as short term rentals. So those are just some possible action items that you can consider when thinking about what you can do to make sure older and historic housing remains affordable. I hope you found this discussion useful and helpful to define the role that older and historic housing is playing in meeting affordable housing needs. If you're interested in learning more about PlaceEconomics and our work, you can find and download all of our reports for free online under the Publications tab on placeeconomics.com. And as you see there, there's my email address. Reach out to me if you have any questions that you'd like to ask.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That was wonderful and so comprehensive. If anybody in the audience has a question, feel free to submit it on the Q&A box, and we will go through some of those. Okay, so I have a question. Let me just figure out how to how to ask it. So we have a question about rent control on older buildings in DC. Is there any data on DC rent control that may suggest a problem with affordable housing stock here? Or where might that data be available on rent control pre-1970s buildings in DC?
Yeah, I don't know anything specifically on DC. And it's kind of hard to talk because rent stabilization and rent control is kind of different in every place you look. The only thing that I can say is that it's really important, especially because like rent control and rent stabilization is usually site specific, right? So it's not something that like someone can take with them to their next house. Like that's what a housing choice voucher is for. So if we're talking about rent stabilization and rent control, it's really important to be talking about retaining that building, right? If it's an older building that's rent stabilized, we need to make sure that we are protecting it, preserving it so that that unit of affordable housing or that building of affordable housing is not lost. So yeah, rent stabilization it's a big thing. It's not everywhere, and everywhere is different with how they deal with it, but it is definitely something that when it's in older buildings, we need to think about keeping, because once we lose it, it's gone because it's site specific.
Yeah, good answer. And we have another one. What happens when a historic district prevents demolition of non-residential properties, for example, a grocery store, to create a mixed-use property, example, grocery store with affordable units above it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything, wrong with that. I think if it's the larger, if affordable housing is a priority in our communities, we need to be thinking about ways that we can continue to add to the supply of affordable housing, right? Of course, we don't want to see a historic commercial building come down, but I think that we need to be a little bit more open to the replacement there. And if it's in, relatively good scale with the rest of the neighborhood, and it is checking off a box of a priority that we have of providing affordable housing, I think we need to be having more discussion about like what are alternatives, what are things, can we incorporate that historic grocery store into the larger development, things like that. But I don't think, we should be seeing it as this is bad and this is good. I think there's a little bit more of a gray area where we need to be kind of more open-minded when it comes to affordable housing.
Yeah. Could the argument be made that reducing the demolition of pre-1970 housing for the purpose of building more expensive housing could lead to a shortage of housing? Did that make sense?
Um, I I think what they might be getting at is that like filtering argument where they're thinking, okay, if we tear down a 2-unit building that's pre-1970 and then we build expensive housing, it'll filter down and some of the other housing in the area will become more affordable, right? Which I know there's been plenty of studies that have come out that like that filtering argument really doesn't happen. What ends up happening is that that new building that's expensive ends up changing kind of the context of that area. And it kind of like I said, with that micro analysis example of that 3-unit condo building, if that just keeps happening over and over again, the surrounding area is just going to continue to increase in price. And it's just has such a ripple effect in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's good to know, and good to know they've done, studies on that as well. Okay. What about expanding the criteria for historic landmarking to make more pre-1970s housing eligible for historic tax credit subsidies? Do you know of anywhere that that's been done, or is that potentially an option moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a great option. I think that's where we need to start re-examining a lot of the standards that we have for historic designation, right? I talked about, Mount Vernon is not the 3 flat down the block. And so if we're thinking about like things like integrity, right? A lot of these neighborhoods, older neighborhoods, have seen a lot of change, and these buildings aren't, necessarily, they don't have the integrity of a high style building, right? So, I mean, there's other options that we can look at. There are neighborhood conservation districts. There are things that I think we should be exploring, apart from even just re-examining our own standards that we put on these buildings. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like out of the box thinking I think we can be doing when it comes to how do we treat these older buildings that aren't maybe in that category of becoming a historic district? How do we retain the context of that neighborhood and retain the affordability of it as well?
Yeah, good answer. So DC obviously has a lot of historic districts. Would you be able to speak specifically to the connection between historic districts and affordable housing, or the potential for affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. DC, I think, has like the highest land share that is designated. So it's kind of, when you look at it, it's almost like the entire city is designated, which I know creates kind of a little bit of its own ecosystem, right? It's very
Yes.
different than other cities in the United States. So I mean, I would probably need to take a little bit more of a detailed look at what's the context of what's happening here. I know I showed those maps at the beginning about where rent burden households are and owner cost burden households are and stuff like that. And yeah, I think overlaying those with the map of DC's districts would be great. But that's just not something that I've personally, like, we have not done a study in DC, so I don't know the specifics of it, but yeah, so.
Yeah, and I think yeah, it's definitely a different ball game with the historic districts in DC. But I think, as you mentioned in your presentation, there are, uppercase preservation, lowercase preservation. But I think there's definitely not a complete bar by any means, because something is designated against affordable housing. So that being said, I know we're kind of running towards the end of our time here. I guess my final question for you would be, how can people get involved in, this campaign to connect affordable housing and historic preservation? And is there a way to maybe lobby isn't the best word, but tell our government officials, or tell other organizations that preserving these spaces is better for affordable housing than tearing down our historic buildings?
Well, I think like the first thing that we can be doing as preservationists is making sure that we're talking to other people, right? Like we don't need to be this insular preservation silo. We should be talking to affordable housing developers. We should be having open conversations with them. As you mentioned, I'm very involved in Landmarks Illinois. Over the last 5 years, we have really worked to make sure that there are people at the table who come from all these various fields. So making sure that you're making those connections and those partnerships and creating allies between all these organizations, like then you're able to really use that network to kind of better get in contact with your local elected officials or your, in DC, like, your real elected officials in DC. But yeah, I think the first step is really making those connections and truly listening to other people, right? Like, again, people have such a opinion about what they think preservationists think, right? And I think we really should be listening and having open ears when it comes to like all the other things that are happening, all the other industries that are part of this crisis, and making sure that we're creating those connections so that we can build our network and advocate better for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's great, and it's definitely something that I know we're committed to at DCPL, diversifying, who is involved. So if you're on this call and you aren't a member of DCPL, feel free to join today. We're also currently working on a context study on affordable housing. So thank you so much, Alyssa. We're so thankful for you and for your presentation. I know I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you again, and I'll send out an email with the recording and maybe some of the resources that you mentioned. But thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. It was great being here.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it. Thank you again, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
Bye-bye.
Bye.